It's my very great pleasure to introduce today's first plenary session. It has two co-authors. I will introduce the author who is absent first, and then I will introduce Tobias. The authors are Professor Joybrato Mukherjee, Danny Mukherjee, who is full professor of linguistics at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. His research interests are applied linguistics, corpus linguistics, and English lexicogrammar and syntax. He served as chair of the executive board of the International Computer Archive of Modern and Medieval English. He compiled the Sri Lankan component of the International Corpus of English and the South Asian Varieties of English, or SAVE, newspaper corpus. The reason why he can't be here is that he's recently been made the president of the University of Cologne. So in fact, if anyone ever had a good excuse not to show up, that is it. But and congratulations to Professor Mukherjee. Now, the speaker who will deliver the co-authored talk is Tobias Bernaisch, who is here with us today. He is senior lecturer for English linguistics in the Department of English at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. His research focus is English corpus linguistics and gender lectal variation. He produced the first comprehensive corpus linguistic account of Sri Lankan English. He's also interested in modeling linguistic epicenters in South Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, among others. And he's been involved in the compilation of large-scale corpus linguistic resources, such as the Sri Lankan components of ICE and SAVE mentioned above. He's created, he uses multifactorial statistic modeling techniques to provide descriptions of the areas of his interest. He's a member of I'm glad to say he's a member of the editorial advisory board for the journal World Englishes, and he has contributed numerous articles and also has done a lot of reviewing for the journal. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Tobias Bernaisch to speak with us today. Thank you, Tobias.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for these kind words of introduction, and thank you also so much to the IAWE committee for giving linguistic epicenters as a concept such a prominent place. So linguistic epicenters, why and what? So I think we're all aware of the fact that there are certain tendencies in world Englishes that are of global reach. We talk about Americanization, we talk about globalization, and we talk about democratization, for instance, on a global scale. And we also know that there are relatively fine-grained national developments. So we have something that's very large, global developments, and we have something that's very small in comparison, national developments. And linguistic epicenters are just in between. They are regionalized developments across national boundaries. And this is what this talk is all about, a journey into linguistic epicenters, and I hope you're going to follow me on this one. So the talk has three different sections. The first part is going to be dedicated to terminology. So what is a linguistic epicenter? How can we define it? What's the state of the art at the moment? In the next section, I'll be talking about linguistic epicenters in South Asian Englishes. So what do we already know about linguistic epicenters in South Asia? Indian English has been proposed as the linguistic epicenter for that region, and the question is, can you show that empirically as well? And if so, how? And let me tell you, from my experience, it's not that easy. And then in the last step, we're going to talk about the future of epicentral research. So what needs to be done in the future to understand that concept a little bit better. To my knowledge, and correct me if you have different input, to my knowledge, the first person that ever used the term epicenter in the context of world Englishes was Leitner in 1992. He said, the emergence of second language centers is therefore to be expected. Epicenters have already been recognized in India, Singapore, and a few other areas. This was in the context of a contribution to pluricentricity. And I think, according to my reading at least, Leitner didn't have that influential concept yet established with regard to epicenters. For him, epicenters, at least to my reading, were regionalized centers of development in India and Singapore, so varieties of English in their own right that emerged in those areas, but he wasn't necessarily thinking at that point about epicenters exerting influences, structural influences on varieties in that region. This then changed in, I think, the most widely adopted definition of linguistic epicenters provided by Hoffmann et al. They have two important characteristics when it comes to linguistic epicenters. And they say, on the one hand, an epicenter is marked internally by endonormative stabilization, so that's the Schneider criterion, phase 4 variety. That is by the widespread use, general acceptance, and codification of the local norms of English. On the other hand, that's the second criterion, on the other hand, an epicenter should also have the potential to serve as a model of English for neighboring countries. That is, exert an influence on other speech communities in the region. So there are these two aspects that define a linguistic epicenter. On the one hand, endonormative stabilization, and on the other hand, we also talk about this regionalized structural influence that we are supposed to see emerge from linguistic epicenters. More recently, in 2022, there have been suggestions with regard to how the epicenter concept can be modified. Meyer here argues that non-standardized varieties that, like Niger and Patois, have strong supralocal and transnational impact without bearing the open prestige of codified standard varieties are thus epicenters of a special type, for which I have suggested the category of informal epicenters within the global English language complex. So here we can see that Meyer argues for varieties having epicentral status, although they might not necessarily have attained endonormative stabilization status. And he also thinks about epicenters as having not only regionalized but also global power in terms of the structures they disseminate, although that's not explicitly mentioned in this quotation here. Schneider in 2022 also talked about linguistic epicenters, and he suggested that it's a prototypical category, that these definitory aspects we just talked about can apply to a stronger or to a weaker extent to given varieties. So he says, epicentral influence is to be seen not as an all or nothing effect, but as a prototypical concept, a relationship which may hold to a lesser or stronger extent and which in turn is composed of and can be detected by a range of composite factors. So far in terms of definition, what linguistic epicenters are all about. If we now look at a world map together, in abstraction, of course, we can look at the areas that have already been covered with regard to linguistic epicenter research. And there are some areas where researchers have been active with regard to linguistic epicenters. There are some areas that haven't been covered that systematically yet. So with regard to North America, the only study that I'm aware of is that by Peruta, looking into the American English, Canadian English constellation. We have some work in the Caribbean by Meyer. We have some work in Africa. The lion's share of work has been done in Asia, particularly South Asia, but also in Southeast Asia. And then there is some work, particularly of lexical nature, in Australia, New Zealand, and in Papua New Guinea. But I mean, consider this an open invitation to join epicentral research. You see, I mean, this map needs to be filled out, and it would be good if more researchers became active in epicentral research as well. And we have, I shouldn't forget that, also Caroline Beaver's work on South Pacific Englishes, who also discusses epicentral constellations in this area. What is it that has been studied in those varieties? And probably we all know Schneider's dynamic model. He argues for the lexis-grammar interface as the area of varietal development, one might say. And as a consequence, it might not be surprising that the majority of work has really been done with regard to this interface. Morphosyntax, lexicogrammar, syntax, whatever you want to call it. There has been some lexical work, but the lion's share has been done here with regard to the lexis-grammar interface, because that's supposed to be indicative of variety development. And also pragmatics have been covered, but that's a marginal area at best, I would say. How has this been done empirically? So what kind of statistical procedures have been applied to understand these epicentral dynamics? And there are three different approaches that have dominated epicentral research. There are descriptive statistics, we have monofactorial inferential statistics, and we have multifactorial statistical models. And I mean, Daniel already said that I work with multifactorial statistical models, so you can probably already tell in which way I'm going to argue. But I mean, all of these approaches are around. And there are also others, as a matter of fact. We have agent-based modeling that was used by Marianne Hund in 2022 to understand whether attitudes can actually influence whether people will be subjected to epicentral influence or not. And there is La Peruta's work employing also a multifactorial approach that was developed by Smadjani et al. In 2019, VADIS, short for variation-based distance and similarity modeling, which is a combination of different multifactorial procedures. So let's look at a concrete example of epicentral structures that could have been disseminated from an epicenter to receiving varieties. And one of these examples is presentational itself. It's a South Asian English feature. Let's meet here today itself. This itself is a pragmatic focus marker, so it puts pragmatic focus on the entity preceding it. So let's meet today and not tomorrow. And we also have other focus particles that work like that, only has pretty much the same function. So these are South Asian features that are not so frequently, if at all, used outside South Asia. So the question is, could it be that this feature has been spread through epicentral mechanisms? And this is a checklist that was actually put together by Marianne Hund in 2013, referring to Meyerhoff-Nizelski, asking epicentral researchers to check these criteria if you want to make an epicentral claim. We can go through that list and see what kind of prerequisites there are to argue for epicentral status. So, A, we have to establish the structural and functional equivalence of the variant found in two varieties. So let's say we look at presentational itself. That means we have to make sure that we have an instance of presentational itself and not of the reflexive pronoun in both of these cases, for instance. So that's still pretty doable, I think, if you look at corpus data, for instance. B is already tricky. You have to distinguish external influence of the potential epicenter by another variety from independent regional parallel developments. All right, so the argument is you have variety A, which may be the epicenter, you have variety B, which may be a variety under epicentral influence, and theoretically, you have two options. Either you have feature A emerge in the epicenter, and then that feature is transferred through language contact from epicenter to periphery. Then that would be an epicentral case. It could, however, also be the case that you have some language contact between English and the local languages, and these two features just emerge in parallel without any transfer from variety A to variety B. Okay, so how are you going to look into that empirically without having any diachronic data whatsoever? So, I mean, theoretically, yes, it's a good point, but empirically, it's almost impossible to work with. And similarly difficult, I find, is also C. We have to assess the evaluation of the variable in the variety that is adopting it, that is, whether speakers use the feature consciously or unconsciously, because that also has repercussions on the roles attitudes can play. And in addition to all of this, we also should take the larger social linguistic context into account and look into the attitudinal side of things. So it is theoretically very well understandable that these criteria should be in place, but empirically they are very hard to work with. So if we now look into one of these features here, namely presentational itself again, we find certain frequency constellations. So that's one approach you can take. That's the descriptive statistic approach. You can look at how frequently is a particular feature used across different South Asian Englishes. And here you see the normalized frequencies of presentational itself, that focus marker, across different South Asian Englishes. And with regard to South Asia, India is regarded as the linguistic epicenter, or has been assumed to be the linguistic epicenter. And then an argument that has been present in epicentral research is that if we have a high frequency in the assumed epicenter and lower frequencies in the varieties surrounding the epicenter, then that might be an indication that there is some epicentral influence. And you find exactly that constellation here. So we have presentational itself being relatively prominent in Indian English, and in all the other varieties surrounding India, we have lower frequencies, lower instances of that feature. If we look at other features, I'm not going to talk you through that entire figure here because it's very small. But we can see the same thing here. So we have an innovative particle verb, cope up with, that's used in Indian and Sri Lankan English. And if you look at this dark red bar, in the middle you see Indian English across different corpus environments. To the left, you see Sri Lankan English, and you can see that across the board, the frequency for Indian English is always higher than Sri Lankan English. So again, people might think, yeah, is that an epicentral influence? Yes or no? But sometimes this just doesn't work out. Sometimes there are features like the complex transitive construction, like this is called as the type 1 superconductors as opposed to this is called the type 1 superconductors, where that type of frequency constellation just doesn't hold. We have Indian English with a relative frequency of that feature compared to only call of 1.4, but in Bangladesh and also in Sri Lanka, we have higher frequencies. So what do you do with that now? Is that then counter-evidence against epicentral influence? I don't know. Maybe that hypothesis that we have a higher frequency in the epicenter and lower frequencies in the varieties around it, maybe that's just not a very good indication when you come to think about it. When you just think about it for a moment, why does it always have to look like this? Right? That's the assumption in a lot of epicentral research. So if you look at some sort of frequency here, and if you look at time here, that has been the assumption in epicentral research for a very long time. You have an epicentral variety here in yellow, and it uses a certain feature with a certain frequency. At some point, that feature gets picked up, and it's also used in the varieties surrounding it. But the level of frequency never quite reaches that of the epicentral variety. This is expressed here by Pavian and Fuchs, for instance. They say, the lower frequency of this feature, some particle, in Hong Kong English and Philippine English compared to Indian English, is commensurate with the hypothesis of spread from Indian English to Hong Kong English and possibly Philippine English. So an epicentral argument is provided on such a frequency constellation. But, I mean, can't we also think about a constellation that looks like that? So, for instance, in Bahamian English, with regard to pseudotitles, Hackett was able to show just that. So she showed that an originally American English feature, like this singer-songwriter Ed Sheeran, so that's a pseudotitle, that was transferred to Bahamian English. And over time, Bahamian English used that feature or started to use that feature more frequently than American English. So in other words, this pure frequency constellation, more frequent in the epicenter, less frequent in a receiving variety, that doesn't hold much water. So what else can be done? And this is something that I'd like to illustrate with regard to South Asia. And there are two things, if we want to identify epicenters, that we need to check. One is social linguistic, the other is empirical diachronic. And it takes us back to that original definition by Hoffman et al. It reminds us that we have to check for endonormative stabilization of a variety, and we have to check for this structural model character of a variety. And if you look at, I'm not going to walk you through the history of Indian English. There are many people in this room that can do this much better than I. But I'm going to try and put across that, yes, Indian English can be regarded as an endonormatively stabilized variety in Schneider's dynamic model because it's a self-dependent post-colonial variety that has literary creativity, that has a positive attitude towards its own variety. And so yes, it can be regarded as an endonormatively stabilized variety. And the same holds true for Sri Lankan English. So that means we have at least two candidates in the South Asia pool for epicentral status. And there are other varieties in the game, obviously. But as far as I know, the sociolinguistic research, the detailed sociolinguistic research for these varieties, although there are publications on them, is to date not yet available to talk about whether they can be regarded as varieties of English in their own right, at least in Schneider's terms. So we have two candidates, at least for epicentral status, based on this endonormative stabilization criterion. But what should we actually look at? So here is a quotation by Peters, 2009, talking about the epicenter metaphor. And she says the term epicenter has its origins in seismic geology and means the outbreaking point of earthquake shocks. That is the point on surface of Earth above the hypocenter, which is the subterranean source of the seismic disturbance. So in other words, what's happening is the epicenter that we actually experience, that we can physically perceive visually and also auditorily, that's a consequence of something that happens below the surface of Earth. And this is pretty much a parallel, I think, to linguistics, to the speech that we create, that we say out loud, that we write down. So we have certain underlying norms that make us choose certain surface structure choices, certain forms in our everyday communication. So there's a model that underlies our language production. Why does that matter? If we look into the dative alternation, the alternation between the double object construction, John gave Mary a book, and the prepositional dative, John gave a book to Mary. If we look into that, then if we have these two examples right here, we see two double object constructions. He gave her, indirect object, a book, direct object. He gave his daughter, indirect object, the freedom to come home late, direct object. So surface structure-wise, that's exactly the same construction. So if you wanted to count how frequently does the double object construction occur, you would say, well, there are two. But if you look at the factors that are likely to trigger these surface structure choices, they are vastly different. You have a pronominal recipient here, and this is a very strong cue for a double object construction. Here, however, you don't have a pronominal recipient, a pronominal indirect object. It's his daughter. It's a noun phrase that doesn't feature a pronoun. But the fact that it's relatively short, that it's non-pronominal, that the patient is comparatively long and abstract, that combination of factors also has a strong cue, is a strong trigger for double object constructions. So in other words, if you were only to focus on the occurrence of structures, you're going to miss out on the underlying differences that trigger these structures. So the argument would be, well, if we want to be true to this model character right here, then we should better look at the underlying models and not at the surface structure choices if we want to do epicentral research. So the idea is to try and statistically model these underlying norms. And this is where I'm going to try and illustrate a little more how this can be done. Before I do that, I also want to point out that if we start looking at these highly frequent alternations, the questions that Hund and also Meyerhoff and Nicelski ask become kind of redundant, and they no longer pose the challenges that we have if we look at these lowly frequent presentational itself features, for instance. So if we look at the dative alternation, for instance, these questions become kind of not so relevant anymore or not so difficult to answer. To what extent are the double object construction and the prepositional dative structurally equivalent and functionally equivalent? Well, that's a yes. What about the distinction of external epicentral influence from regional parallel developments? Well, in most varieties of English, these two variants have been around from the very start. So that's not a question you definitely need to ask. So we can answer that just like that. And whether the feature is used consciously or not is also, I think, secondary. So in other words, if you look at these alternation phenomena, the questions that relate to these, what one might call linguistic butterflies, iconic structures, but relatively infrequent structures, are not that applicable anymore. So how do we try to find epicentral influence with regard to the dative alternation then? The dative alternation, some people say there are three research branches in linguistics. There is historical linguistics, there is synchronic linguistics, and there is the dative alternation. So I'm not going to bore you with going through these factors that influence which of these two variants you're going to choose at the end of the day. Just know there are a number of different factors that influence which of these two variants you're going to be choosing at the end of the day. We annotated and extracted data from the South Asian varieties of English corpus to understand epicentral dynamics here. We have 6 South Asian Englishes, the ones that I presented earlier as well. We have data from British English as reference data, and we used give as a prototypical verb to extract instances of the dative alternation. We annotated for all of the different factors that I just listed and just skipped over. So we accounted for all of these different factors that we know have an influence on double object construction as opposed to prepositional dative. And then it gets interesting. All right, so follow me on this one, okay? So let's assume we have an Indian English speaker, epicentral candidate, on the left-hand side. And that speaker produces a certain output. She gave the boys a hard task, double object construction. They gave candy to the kids, prepositional dative. Now, we have a Sri Lankan speaker, and we're trying to find out to what extent this Indian English speaker might be a model for Sri Lankan English speaker choices. She produces, he gave the girls an easy task. That's pretty parallel. The boys, the girls, a hard task, an easy task. So that's pretty much compatible with one another. Yeah, we have a 2-word long indirect object, 3-word long direct object, same here, and the same construction is chosen. So that's a match. They gave candy to the kids. We have a direct object of 1 word, an indirect object of 2 words, and the prepositional dative is chosen. We have the same frequency constellation, 2-word indirect object, 1-word direct object, but a double object construction is chosen instead. So that would be a mismatch. How are we going to account for this? The approach that Stefan Kries and I developed together to work on epicentral dynamics is based on his MAPDA approach that he and his colleagues have developed over a couple of years, actually since 2014. It stands for multifactorial prediction and deviation analysis using regression or also random forest. And the first step is you assume you have a certain epicentral candidate on the left-hand side, and you create a statistical model for that epicentral candidate. So step number 1 is you create a regression model or a random forest that statistically represents the linguistic choices that speakers are making. Step number 1. In a second step, then, what you do is, and this is, I think, the one contribution that Stefan's MAPDA approach is known for. It takes this statistical model that you created for a reference variety speaker, an epicentral speaker that you assume. So you take that statistical model and you feed it data from other speakers. And you then get information on, okay, with this set of speakers that you want to understand, in our case, the Sri Lankan speaker, if you feed the Sri Lankan data into the Indian model, you get an indication of what Sri Lankan English speakers what Indian English speakers would have chosen in the context in which the Sri Lankan English speakers were. So you get an indication of, okay, this is what the Indian English speaker, the epicentral speaker, would have chosen statistically, and this is what the Sri Lankan English speaker actually chose. So you get an indication of how well the Indian English model, the epicentral model, the assumed epicentral model, predicts the choices by speakers from varieties that are assumed to be under epicentral influence. And then you do that repeatedly. You start doing that not only with Indian English as the assumed epicenter, but you take all the different epicentral candidates as these potential reference varieties. So you start out with Indian English, and you let Indian English predict all the choices of the other 5 South Asian Englishes. And then you're going to see, okay, how well does Indian English do that? And that's your first run, that's your first iteration. You throw Indian English out, you take Sri Lankan English in as the potential epicenter, and you let it predict, again, the other 5 South Asian Englishes. And you check how well does Sri Lankan English do that job of predicting the other varieties. And you do it for Bangladeshi, and you do it for Pakistani, and for all the other South Asian Englishes. So that at the end of the day, you arrive at such a relatively neat graph that sums up how well the individual varieties here, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, the Maldives, and so on, how well they predicted the varieties in the region. And here you can see the summed absolute deviations, so the number of incorrect predictions, as a matter of fact. And we can see 2 things. If you use British English as a reference model, it has the highest amount of errors. So in other words, British English, and that's not surprising to anybody. I mean, British English doesn't predict South Asian dative alternation choices well. But I mean, that's not going to surprise anybody. On the other hand, we see that Indian English, as a matter of fact, does the best job of modeling choices with regard to the dative alternation in South Asian Englishes. So, of course, there are other very good candidates as well, Maldives and Pakistan, but Indian English, as a matter of fact, does the best job. So that means we have certain indications that, yes, I mean, Indian English might be, from a structural perspective, the epicenter with regard to the dative alternation. But what about the attitudes? Shouldn't all other varieties in South Asia then love Indian English and embrace their structures, embrace how Indian English speakers use that variety? And so for that, we need attitudinal evidence. And this is a picture that I took in Morlaix, actually, in 2022, last December. and people had very explicit ideas about India there, at least once prior, I would have to say. So the question is, with regard to attitudes by speakers, do speakers of South Asian English actually like Indian English? Would they accept it as an epicenter? And I asked Sri Lankan speakers that, among other things. I asked them to rate, and that goes back almost 10 years now, to be honest. I asked people to rate British English, American English, Sri Lankan English, and Indian English. So Sri Lankan speakers were asked, how do you like these varieties? What do you like about them? I tried to quantify this somehow on the basis of a 6-point semantic differential scale with 13 bipolar pairs. And I'm going to show you the results and eventually a ranking of varieties. So to what extent do Sri Lankan speakers, which might be under epicentral influence by India, actually like Indian English? So you can see the individual descriptors, the positive sides of these 13 bipolar pairs right there. And then you can see the ranking from very, very bad to very, very good. Maybe you can muse upon which variety Sri Lankan English speakers might like best before I show you the results. Yeah? So musing is done. Ready for the results? Yeah? Okay. So this is the rating for Indian English, okay? So you can see that Indian English is rated by Sri Lankan speakers relatively positively for friendliness and for being humble, so solidarity. I think we talked about this yesterday also in the plenary. So Indian English ranks high according to Sri Lankan speakers on these solidarity aspects. Where's going to be British English in relation to Indian English? Who would say it's higher up? Who would say it's further down? That's British English. So across the board, Sri Lankan English speakers appreciate British English more than Indian English. There's only 2 areas, humbleness and friendliness, solidarity, where British English gets worse ratings. But other than that, across the board, British English receives better ratings. Sri Lankan English speakers rate their own variety somewhere in between British English and Indian English, and with regard to American English, we can see that it rates high on modernity and that it rates relatively low for formality. So if we create the grand means of these means, then this is the rundown that we get. So these are, again, Sri Lankan speaker attitudes towards these varieties. And we can see that British English comes first, Sri Lankan English comes second, American English is third. And this line here represents the cutoff line between positive attitudes and negative attitudes. So there's a slightly negative attitude by Sri Lankan English speakers towards Indian English. What that means for epicentral influence is up for discussion really at this point in time. But yeah, with regard to Indian English as a linguistic epicenter for South Asian Englishes, we can say Indian English has reached the phase of endonormative stabilization. We can say that Indian English serves as the best structural model with regard to the dative alternation, as was shown, but also with regard to the genitive alternation. We also checked that. But there are slightly negative attitudes towards Indian English. So where do we go from here? What's to be done next? One obvious thing really is epicentral influence is a diachronic process. And what we just looked at was synchronic evidence from SAFE, which was mainly collected in 2005. So you definitely need diachronic corpus data. So that's step number 1. And there are a couple of other things that, if you want to understand that concept well, that need to be taken into consideration statistically, but also, I think, social linguistically. I'm going to start out with the statistical side of things. Particularly when you use monofactorial statistical designs, so when you compare frequencies across varieties and you only have variety as your predictor and disregard other factors, then this is going to lead to an overestimation of variety differences. Because a statistical model will only have variety as the one explanatory variable, then of course all of the variation in your data will be explained with the help of variety, although other factors might be important and responsible for these effects. Sometimes some studies also lose information with regard to certain predictors. So for instance, age is a classic case. Sometimes people have very specific information on how old speakers were, but they use categories like old or young, and they don't use the precise numeric information. That leads to information loss and makes the statistical model less reliable. Interactions should be part of a well-defined statistical model. So sometimes you see that people compare data from, say, the 1960s to the 1990s, and they run different statistical models on these. So for epicentral influence, that would mean if we were to, look into epicentral dynamics since 2005, we would create one big data set with data from 2005 and 2020 to see whether this diachronic development makes a change. But sometimes people just split up their data sets accordingly. They have a 2005 and a 2020 data set, and not a joint one. And that then leads to the fact that, we actually don't really explore whether diachrony has an important statistical effect. So it's important to use interactions and not to separate data sets if you want to understand the whole picture. And repeated measures is an issue. I mean, in corpus linguistics, it's very often the case that one corpus speaker contributes several examples, but some of the statistical models that are occasionally used cannot account for that systematically. So that's also something that some models, however, like random forests or mixed effects models can take care of, and it's going to improve the results that you're going to get out. Sociolinguistically, diachrony is definitely an issue. So if you look into contemporary epicentral studies, you would probably also want to take attitudes into account. But if you do attitude surveys right now and do a corpus study parallel to that, then the thing is, you should have probably looked into attitudes 10 years ago or 15 years ago to understand the epicentral consequences of these attitudes. So if you have attitudinal data from right now, it cannot influence the linguistic choices of the corpus speakers that you're looking at. You have to have a precedence of attitudes, and then the structural features will follow. Scarcity of records. I mean, I did some work with Pam Peters on lexicography in New Zealand and also in Australia, where we looked into dictionaries of Australian English, historical dictionaries of Australian English, and also New Zealand English. That's just not available for many varieties to understand epicentral dynamics. I mean, you can be lucky to find a dictionary of Sri Lankan English or Indian English, but there are no historical dictionaries, at least to my knowledge, so that makes it difficult, the scarcity of historical records. Difference in granularity is also another issue. So now we know, for instance, that Sri Lankan speakers do not have a positive attitude towards Indian English. How do you integrate this piece of information into an example-based statistical model that's used to represent corpus linguistic choices? So we have differences of granularity. We have something that relates to an entire variety, namely attitudes, and we have something else that relates to individual speakers of that variety, namely corpus data. How are you going to marry these two? It's difficult. And as a consequence of that, at the moment, at least to my knowledge, most of the time, these attitudinal aspects are rather used post hoc to explain certain findings that you get in corpus linguistics, but you don't use them as predictors in the statistical models of these structures. But that's something that would be very nice. I mean, this is a plenary, so we can dream big, right? So ideally, you would have corpus data from a particular speaker, and you would know everything from that speaker, when that speaker goes to bed, what that speaker has for breakfast, what the age is, what the gender is, So you would want to have that information to integrate all of this into a statistical model. But yeah, I mean, maybe that's going to happen at some future point, but at the moment, it's just not available. I want to talk about something that I'm currently involved in. We are trying to get a little closer to understanding linguistic epicenters in South Asia. And it's really, baby steps, but we're trying to get as close as possible to understanding epicentral dynamics in South Asia. And this is a project on epicenters in world Englishes, empirical diachronic studies of present-day South Asian Englishes. It's funded by the German Research Foundation, and it runs until February 2025. It's coordinated by Stefan Kries and myself, and Carola Schmidt, who's also in the audience, is going to give an excellent paper later on, so please feel free to attend. She's doing her PhD there, and Nina Funk is doing the other PhD in that project. And we're looking at the same set of varieties, but we're trying to get a bigger picture here this time around. So we are using a short-term diachronic database. We're using the South Asian varieties of English corpus that I talked about earlier, but also a 2020 update. So we at least have a short-term diachronic perspective on all of that. we try not to look at one feature, but at 4 alternations to get a bigger picture, morphosyntactic alternations and lexicogrammatical alternations. And we try to combine these corpus linguistic studies, again, with attitudes, verbal guise techniques to get implicit ratings with regard to how people feel about these varieties. And we're doing that for all of South Asia. I mean, Nina and Carola just traveled across Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and India, came back very exhausted, but with tons and tons and tons of excellent data, and we're so much looking forward to looking into that and understanding that. So we have implicit attitudes from verbal guise techniques, and we also have explicit rankings on how the people feel about different varieties. So we're trying to get the best of everything here. If that works out, we don't know at this point, but we're looking forward to it, and we'll look forward to reporting our findings at one of the next IAWE conferences. I thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for a very elegantly formulated and timely presented plenary. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. My understanding is that there are helpers on either side with microphones, and so please raise your hand if you have questions for Dr. Bernaisch. Yes, I see some down here.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. I notice you don't talk at all about possible founder effects in epicenter research. I mean, is that an aspect you've looked into? I mean, I've read here and there of Indian teachers being very important in the region in the early period, together with British missionaries and other teachers and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you for that input. It's a story to be told in the future. So at the moment, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand epicentral dynamics to find out which model variety explains structural choices in different South Asian Englishes well. And as I said, it's a story to be constructed. With regard to Indian English, I mean, it's, I think, not even a secret that Indian English has a vibrant textbook industry with textbooks being disseminated all across South Asia. We also know that, for instance, I mean, when I visited the Maldives, I talked to the local teachers there, and yeah, I mean, many of them had Indian origin, and so that is definitely something that's going to influence the way in which Indian English spreads across different states in South Asia. It's something that we will have to explore more systematically. For the time being, we're trying to do the empirical side of things, and we will also, in explanations of this, of course, not only rely on attitudes, but also on historical evidence like patterns of migration. So thank you for that. It's something we will definitely take into account.
Couple of things.
Yeah.
First one about double object construction.
Yeah.
In the Indian variety of English, indirect object does not even surface. Mm-hmm. So on the basis of what and where did you get this data to work on double object construction in epicentral research? Number one.
Yeah.
Number two, what is the assumption of 6 varieties of South Asian Englishes?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at even India, you will find it. I don't want to give a number. You will find 10 different varieties.
Can, yeah.
So what's the purpose? What's the point of categorizing Indian English as one variety among the 6 in your research? And is this something that is compelling you to look at epicenter? Because on the basis of these structural points, structural data that you show, epicenter doesn't seem to be quite yet there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you for those questions. Number one, I mean, I've looked at tons of data from Indian English, and if you look at it empirically, there are double object constructions and there are prepositional datives where indirect objects do surface and where direct objects do surface. So there is this alternation in Indian English, and there are prepositional datives and double object constructions where both object slots are filled. So the data comes from newspapers, English medium newspapers, the Times of India, for instance. We source a lot of data from them. So it's newspaper data, I would say, acrolectal, close to standard Indian English. And that gets me to your second point. So is it okay to say there's one Indian English? And as so often in academia, I think we have to say it depends. It depends on what you look at. If you think about pronunciation in Indian English, you can't put a number to how many different Indian Englishes there are. I fully agree. For the time being, however, if you look at grammatical structures like the ones that I presented, or the focus marking structures that I talked about, these are pervasive across different Indian Englishes, grammatically speaking. So I agree that with regard to pronunciation, we have a plethora of different Indian Englishes. Looking at their syntax, however, the research has so far shown that there is homogeneity across India. And it remains to be determined in the future whether that homogeneity also holds. I mean, maybe I can say that I'm currently publishing a volume with Claudia Lange, Sven Leukert, and Asia Yurchenko, looking at exactly that, looking at grammatical variation within Indian Englishes. And we find large areas of homogeneity, actually. So I agree, phonologically, there is variation across different Indian Englishes, but syntactically, there is a relatively large degree of homogeneity, I would assume. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Sorry, somebody had a question there.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating talk. My question's rather similar to the question that the gentleman over there has just said. In terms of Sri Lankan English, you have Tamil speakers of Sri Lankan English, and you have Sinhala speakers of Sri Lankan English, and yet you're talking about Sri Lankan English. So that was my first question regarding homogeneity in Sri Lankan English. And the second question was on the attitudinal perspectives of those who you interviewed. How do you take account of something like social class in respect of those who are giving their opinions about what they think about different Englishes?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, with regard to the first question, I would probably give a relatively similar answer in the sense that, yes, I mean, there is variation, more so on the lexical and on the phonological level in Sri Lankan Englishes, not so much on the grammatical level, which is our object of investigation. Yeah, and I have to be honest, I mean, I collected almost 200 surveys back in the day from Sri Lanka, and I, of course, documented age, gender, social class, educational level, and I tried to see to what extent that would influence how people rate the different varieties, and I was very disappointed to see that there was nothing. I mean, it was unanimous. It was unanimous. So I couldn't make any multifactorial model work based on the social biographic information that I had that would be significant enough. So these seem to be very stable tendencies across different social classes, relatively uniform, I have to say. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask a question quickly?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then Professor Ustino.
Oh, okay. So I also want to echo Professor Davis' remarks about the elegance with which you presented it, and also the sophistication of the model that you are using and the kind of various considerations that you are using in terms of statistical analysis of these data and so on. And I think that is very much needed because a lot of the earlier studies were descriptive without going into detail the factors that really produce the particular variation. Having said that, I have a general observation, and that is that, as you know, the corpus that you use for analyzing these tendencies is basically written corpus and printed corpus, and from newspapers and things like that. And the written language is always more conservative than the spoken language. And we have ourselves found in hundreds of studies that there is a great deal of variation of, sorry, just at this time. I don't even know how to stop this. Yeah, there's a great deal of variation in the actual spoken language, which is not reflected in the newspapers, for example.
Yeah.
So there is a tremendous gap between how people speak in their, even if you take their ordinary, even the educated people's speech, as opposed to writing. So how are you going to deal with that in future work? I know that this is a different thing, but.
Yeah, I mean, maybe 2 points. We could talk about this for hours, I think. I mean, on the one hand, yes, I mean, it's written language. On the other hand, if you find certain variety-specific features or tendencies in newspaper language, then you also can be sure that it's an established feature of that variety, I would argue. Because sometimes a newspaper article, before it's being published online, before it's being spread, goes through several hands of editors that agree that, yes, I mean, this is how the language should be used in that newspaper article. Sometimes, you know, I communicate with people in South Asia and I point out, hey, when we last talked, you used that or that feature. That's the Sri Lankan English feature. And then they would say, no, I didn't use that, you know? So you don't have that story necessarily. So the issue with spoken data is that sometimes you also get performance issues, which is in the most cases a minority thing, I guess. But you don't have that phenomenon in newspaper language per se. And yeah, newspaper language I think is also nice because it's not only a representation of the acrolectal standard, if you can call it that, but it's also a cultural loudspeaker in that sense. So people not only, people also look for it for orientation in non-standardized varieties. But I fully agree, to paint the bigger picture, I would love to have millions and millions of data of spoken material, and I'm waiting for that day until AI can very precisely transcribe audio recordings. And I mean, I hope I still got a couple of years, you know, of waiting that I can do. And then maybe it's going to happen in like 10 years, and then I'm going to give you as much spoken data as you want. Looking forward to that already myself.
Now we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for very thought-provoking discussion. My question, what's your stand on the existence of European English versus German English, Russian English, and depending on your answer, do you think it's possible that there will be emergence of linguistics epicenters of English in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an interesting question. It's a thought-provoking question. I mean, status-wise, we have, a difference in terms of how English is used. I mean, of course, in South Asia, we look at second language varieties, Kashubian outer circle, as opposed to the expanding circle. In Europe, it has been done in the past that models from World Englishes have been adopted in the expanding circle. I mean, I'm thinking about Schneider's dynamic model, 2003, 2007, for instance, that has been adopted to foreign language contexts. So, as such, it is possible that, you can try and do it. The question is, how beneficial would it be, and which varieties would you probably want to profile as potential epicenters? So with Indian English, for me, based on theoretical conceptualizations, it seems, based on its history, based on the number of speakers, based on the locale, in the center, in the heart of South Asia, it seems like a very good candidate for epicentral influence. And one might have to think about what are potential influential varieties in the EFL context. But it's thought-provoking. I would have to think a little more about it. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Tobias Bernaisch.
Thank you so much for your time.